But I want to start with a story, actually. So about a year ago, I think it probably was, I decided for my vacation I had some extra weeks. As often is the case, clergy don't take all the vacation that they're supposed to. And so I went ahead and did a staycation at home. And so that gave me the opportunity to go around to some different places and check out different churches. And on one of these Sundays, there was a church that I had been really excited about going to check out. Now I'll promise you, it was not a church here in the Diocese of Chicago, so don't worry about that. But I was really excited to go and check it out because of some liturgical particularities that they had. So I show up at the church, and the first thing that happens is the door that is sort of the natural architectural entrance was open. It was open at least. But there was no usher there. So this was the door sort of that was right into the narthex, into the nave. No usher whatsoever. And I had to hunt to find an usher to get a bulletin for this church. I found the usher actually at the door that led from their fellowship hall or parish hall directly into the nave. So it was pretty clear that this was a door that was used mostly by members coming from formation before the service. So I get my seat and I'm sitting through the service, and one of the things I start to notice is that no one is acknowledging me at all. There is no engagement. There is no connection, no waves, no smiles, no hi, good to see you. And in fact, I don't think that anyone even passed the peace to me when we got to the peace. So then it comes to the end of the service, and the dismissal happens, and I'm thinking I've got better things to do with my life, and so I move as fast as possible out of that space. And as I'm leaving, I get my first interaction with someone other than the usher who I had to hunt down. And that person sticks their head out and says, "It was great to have you." That's it. No invitation to coffee hour. No, we'd love to see you again. No, what was your name? It was great to have you. And the really disappointing thing is this church was supposed to have had a solemn high mass that day, and it was just a low mass. So that was the cherry on top of all of that stuff. So I framed that because I left feeling pretty completely ignored and disconnected from that space. And I knew the whole script. I'm a priest. I'm a priest in the diocese. I knew about the reputation of this place. I knew what I was supposed to do in terms of going and finding an usher, that was probably going to be the place where they were. I kind of knew what church architecture could look like to figure out where I was supposed to be. And I still felt discombobulated. And so part of what that hit for me was thinking, what if I hadn't been a priest? What if I had been someone who was trying to re-engage with church after 15 years? What if I'd been someone who was extremely apprehensive and was just barely willing to even make it through that door? This is really the conversation that we're going to be moving into, is because another story to sort of frame things is when I first got to my church at Trinity, one of the things I kept hearing from people was, well, we're declining, we're shrinking, we probably need to really aggressively look at the churches that are growing. We need to probably pick up the things that they're doing. And for Episcopalians, what that almost always means is we need to look at what they're doing in worship and figure out how we can change our worship. Because worship is so central to our identity, we assume that must be the thing that's working or failing most of the time. So, the number of times I heard people referencing community church or any of these other sort of mega non-denominational churches in our area, and said we need to look like them, or should we move out to the suburbs and build a building out there? That seems to be where churches are growing. Do we need to bring in a praise band? Do we need to change our liturgy? Do we need to do something different about, not to be crass, but the product that we're offering? And so that's really the question that I want to hold for us for this entire session is the problem that we have ultimately an identity problem? That is to say, is there something that is leading to our decline, leading to our dwindling influence and connection in the culture that results from who we are in terms of our worship, in terms of our theology, in terms of maybe our locations? Or is it ultimately that a lot of what has led to us being where we are now and where we might be in the future has to do with institutional hygiene? So that's something that I want to hold before you right now. So a lot of this is related to the question about growth. Growth is a question that is on people's minds. Decline is a question that is on people's minds. And we're going to get to the numbers in just a second. But I do want to hold out that, like I said at the beginning, hygiene is ultimately a matter of hospitality. It's a matter of making the space and the community that we're in a place where people who are strangers can feel welcomed and feel embraced. And so before we get into the question about growth, which does matter, but before we get into the question about growth, I want to get to the point that this hospitality is something that we should do even if it didn't have any demonstrable impact on our numbers. Or even if we were to somehow get to a place where our buildings were bursting at the seams and we felt like we couldn't welcome any more people in to our communities, hospitality would still be a theological expectation.
Amen.
So we begin with Scripture, right? So right from the beginning, we see the story of Abraham and Sarah welcoming the three guests by the oaks of Mamre. Abraham and Sarah welcome them. They're travelers. They don't know them. They turn out, this is the framework for Hebrews 13:2, some have entertained angels without knowing it. That's kind of the background and the framing of that. In Genesis, we then get also the sort of the mirror image of that, unfortunately often deployed for homophobic reasons, but in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, what we have is ultimately this utter and complete failure of hospitality. We then get in Leviticus and throughout the law this expectation that you were sojourners, you were aliens, you were slaves in Egypt. Don't repeat that mistreatment, but instead treat the alien, the sojourner, the stranger in your midst well. And then, of course, when we get to the New Testament, this is just magnified. We get, as I said, Hebrews 13:2, some have entertained angels without knowing it, and so show hospitality to strangers. And a framing for that that consistently happens is the reason that you do this is like we see in Matthew 25, because in embracing the stranger, in showing hospitality and welcome to the stranger, you are entertaining Christ himself. This is something that is, again, related to our baptismal covenant, which we'll get to in a second, that when you are seeking and serving Christ in all others, you are encountering Christ. It's sort of the inverse of what you often hear, which is we should go out into the world to bring Christ to people. No, we should go out into the world in order to encounter Christ in people around us. So one of the things that is really interesting is that we get this encounter with Christ on the road to Emmaus, the story that we will get after Easter. And the two disciples are walking on the road to Emmaus, and they encounter the stranger. And then in that encounter with the stranger, who they bring along and ultimately break bread with, they then encounter Christ in this person. And I think that what's really cool about this image is that it offers this sort of presentation and I think provocative question for us of how are we able to encounter Christ in the Eucharist if we've not already encountered Christ in the stranger before the Eucharist starts? I mean, I think that we can, but I think that there's something that's a little bit amiss there in having a Eucharistic assembly that is extremely hostile or at least indifferent to the stranger to then expect to encounter Christ on the altar. And so I'll say this, because any discussion about hospitality and Eucharist is obviously going to bring up at some point the question of communion without baptism. I think that is a red herring. And I personally, I subscribe to the official canonical position about communion without baptism. I think that baptism is a necessary prerequisite, even though I'm not checking anyone's baptismal certificate at the altar rail. But again, I think that's a red herring because, first of all, most people understand that there are boundaries within religious communities. And we would not expect to go into other religious communities without having gone through sort of rites of initiation and engage in their most holy acts. And the second point is that we can all probably know from practice that there are communities that practice the sort of the strict Eucharistic boundary keeping that is expected by the canons that have remarkable feeding and hospitality programs. And then there are other churches that have said, we're going to open up the table, and we think our job is done. That is our Eucharistic hospitality. But then they lock their bathroom doors. So it is true that the Eucharist should be a central locus for us as Christians that leads to our hospitality, in the sense that we are formed in seeing Christ and being conformed to Christ in Eucharist. But in order to go out into the world and to open our community and to practice the kind of radical meal hospitality that Jesus engaged with, not in a ritual context, but in the context of his ministry in the world, that our Eucharistic activity should open up to feeding the poor, opening our space to the stranger, and allowing them to encounter the community that may one day lead them to seeking baptism and then therefore access to the table. But again, I think that there's multiple ways you can approach it, but the first point is, do not allow your focus to drift when we talk about hospitality primarily to the table. It happens way before that. And then finally, at this point, if we're talking about Anglicanism and hospitality, because of the way in which we have engaged with the Benedictine tradition and seen Benedictine spirituality as foundational to so much of our Anglican spirituality, we would be remiss if we did not point out that hospitality to the stranger within Benedictine spirituality and practice is an incredibly central thing. And again, this is related to Matthew 25, the idea that in the stranger who you are welcoming in, particularly the stranger who is in desperate need of that lodging or the food or the warmth or whatever it might be, you are encountering and treating Christ with that hospitality. So this is all also to say, before we move significantly further, that one of the things we have to disentangle in our minds is fellowship and hospitality. And this is something that even in my context we've not fully done. We talk about our hospitality team, which is the team that does coffee hour and does meals for the parish and those sorts of things. And that's really adopting hospitality from a sort of a corporate perspective, hospitality in the sense of the hospitality industry. But when we're thinking theologically, we really need to distinguish these things. Hospitality is about the stranger. Hospitality is about the person who is not part of our community. Hospitality is about opening our space to those who need respite, who need food, who need a place to just relax for a little bit, who we've never met before. Fellowship is how we build those bonds internally, and those are both important things, but we collapse them at our peril. And then, of course, we have this deeply baptismal ecclesiology, the understanding of the ministry of all the laity that is rooted, and not just the laity, but that all people in the church, grounded in baptism. And in baptism, we promise to seek and serve Christ in all persons, which is not actually just a way of sort of sliding in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What it really is saying is that we seek to see Jesus Christ in every single person who we come across, and especially in those who we are least likely to think we are going to encounter Christ in. And so this hospitality, this opening up of our communities, this making our spaces and our communities places where people feel welcomed, and feel at ease, at least at ease on things that they shouldn't have to feel dis-ease about. This is something that is profoundly rooted in our scriptural, our theological, and our liturgical heritage. Before we go into the numbers, I do want to say that the theological backing for hospitality and welcome is not disconnected from the obligation that comes right before in the baptismal covenant, which is that we are to share by word and example the good news of God in Christ. Invitation and evangelism are also not disconnected from what we do. And when we talk about growth, these things have to come together. Because if no one knows to ever show up at your building, it doesn't matter how hospitable you are. But then also, if you get loads and loads of people to come, and then they feel terrible when they get there, they're probably not going to stick around. These two things are intricately linked. But before we go further into all of this, and this is not primarily about how you sort of supercharge your marketing out there, even though we will talk about some digital strategy in the second session, I do want to say any strategy towards growth in your congregation has to begin with prayer. This is something we can easily forget as we jump over and begin to go into sort of the strategies and the techniques that we do. But we remember, as 1 Corinthians says, God gives the growth. There's no way that we can sort of optimize growth of a congregation that is not rooted first and foremost in the movement of the Spirit in our communities. And so I'll actually share something that we do. There's the collect that comes after the reading for the binding of Isaac in the Easter Vigil service. I would recommend taking a look at that because it speaks about actually the extension of the promise that is offered to Abraham and the increase in the number of people who are part of that blessing essentially that extended out and expanded to the church as well. That is one of 5 prayers that are drawn from different places in the prayer book that we have actually built into the end of morning prayer that we do every morning on Facebook. So at the end of those general intercessions, we actually have a different prayer for growth that happens in our morning prayer service. And I really recommend doing that. And I recommend before engaging seriously with the question of growth, you ask for it. And you ask for it from God. And then be prepared for what that might look like, because it's going to be an influx of people who don't look like you, who begin to change your community, and who make it something difficult and different, and ultimately wonderful and amazing. But growth is not actually from the standpoint of people who are used to stasis and unmitigated good. If you are used to the way things are, growth in a church is going to cause some friction. And one of the things I remember seeing from someone posted this from a church, one of the few churches, the Episcopal Church, that is going kind of gangbusters, that said, you can have a comfortable church or you can have a growing church, but you can't have both. So, we talked about the theological grounding, but let's move into the numbers. We all have probably had some exposure to the numbers, right? In general, we know that Christianity is a decreasing part of market share in the United States, and that this is happening generationally. So we can look and see that silent generation and boomers, about 80% of them identify with Christianity, which is again not the same as saying that they go to church, but they identify with Christianity. About 70% of Gen X does, millennials about 50%, and then Gen Z, which is high school, college, young adults right now, about 45% of them identify with Christianity. And of course, the numbers look even worse for the mainline. You can look at, in the 70s, about 30% of Americans identified with a mainline tradition, whereas now we're in the 11 to 10% of the society at large identifies with being mainline. We saw coming out of COVID that something like only a third of Episcopalians who identify as Episcopalians are actually in church on any given Sunday. Those numbers continue to go down, and the trajectory looks pretty bleak. Most of us have probably experienced this in one way or another. The good news, for those of you who have not seen these numbers but have experienced in your local community, is you're not alone. The bad news is you're not alone. These numbers are, if the trend continues, we risk becoming so small and insignificant that we are not able to make a meaningful dent in the culture around us. We're not able to make a meaningful, so maybe step back and say, we don't want growth for its own sake. But if we believe that it is important to have a liturgically rich, inclusive form of Christianity in this country, you have to have more people going into the future in order to continue that. If you believe that it is important to have the programs that we have, it's like this, I'm really excited about this community garden here, and I want to learn more about it, but programs like community gardens, like the feeding ministries, like the space that we offer to people for recovery groups, for Boy Scouts, for Girl Scouts, for all the many things that we offer that would not be offered otherwise. If we want that to continue to exist, we have to have people in our communities to make sure that that keeps happening. And so some sort of numerical growth is important. So this is then where we get into that question about, well, should we just become like megachurches? Because it is true that megachurches do seem to be growing. I mean, the statistics are out there that the churches that are growing in the United States are non-denominational or non-denominational like megachurches, and that they're growing pretty quickly. So that's, I think, what fuels a lot of this question about, do we have to change our identity to become more like them? Or I should say, do we have to change our identity to become more like them in terms of their worship style, theology, these practices that if we were to engage in them would ultimately actually get rid of all that stuff that I just said. If we wanted to continue to exist in the culture, we need to have people. Are we between this rock and a hard place of having to say, if we want to continue as an institution, we have to get rid of the things that actually make it worthwhile for our institution to continue? Or is it possible that there are other things that indeed we can learn from those kinds of communities that have nothing to do with their worship or their theology, but have to do with how they structure their space, how they structure their welcome, how they structure their follow-up? So you're going to actually see that we do draw from a number of different sources that are more in the evangelical and non-denominational world, because my thesis is that it has a lot more to do with that's the stuff that they're doing right that is really leading to growth. It's not actually so much to do with their theology and their worship style. And even if it was, it is also worth remembering that the Episcopal Church has never been the majority of people in this country. We have always been a relatively small slice of the entire religious landscape in the United States. But you can be a thriving, growing small slice niche market. Just to say that we are going to be small does not mean that we have to be declining, right? So, one of the things when we talk about hygiene and use this metaphor. Oh, yes?
Sorry to interject. The St. Andrew Church has an influx of young people.
Mm-hmm.
People coming from places like Willow Creek. And a lot of the young people have told me, could we just get rid of the hymn book and have, some more modern music?
Yeah.
But the older folks in the church say, no, that's what makes us Episcopalian. What response should I have?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will touch on that a little bit about worship accessibility in just a second. I'll tell you what we've done, because music actually is probably the biggest place where we should have the most flexibility. When I say we don't need to get rid of our liturgical identity, what I mean is we don't need to get rid of sort of the ordo of the Book of Common Prayer. We don't need to get rid of the structures that we have in terms of being a Eucharistic community, in following the words of the Book of Common Prayer, which binds us with Anglicanism throughout history. But it is worth remembering that music is one of the more fluid aspects of our identity historically, and also probably one of the biggest barriers for people who did not grow up in a tradition that has hymns and organ and choir. What we have done at my congregation is we just started a whole new service, which is not a praise band service, but it's acoustic guitar driven. We do a mixture of sort of the kinds of hymns that we have in both Lift Every Voice and Sing and 82 that would be known by evangelicals if they are going to know hymns. Teze, and we also do a fair number of sort of theologically vetted contemporary Christian songs, praise and worship songs in that service. But we still follow the prayer book liturgy to a T. Although still, again, stripped down. I don't vest for that service. We use real bread instead of wafers. There's actually a really huge difference between our 9:30 Solemn High Mass and our 4:30 Acoustic Eucharist. But what we sort of talk about is that 4:30 is the onboarding for the liturgically curious, but with music that is going to be more accessible.
Thank you.
Yes.
Would you be able to share some of the music options that email or something?
Yeah, my email is going to go up at the end of this, so feel free to email me and ask me about that, or talk a little bit in one of the breaks or after. We can definitely talk about that. And so, one more question here. Yeah.
On your question about identity, and for context, if you go to an urban church in Edgewater in Chicago, we seem to be a lifeboat congregation for people from other Christian backgrounds. Some other Episcopal churches in the city are actually getting people who have no church background at all, but we seem to identify ourselves as Episcopalians by what we are not.
Yeah.
This is what we are. We're Catholic, but we're not crazy conservative. We're evangelical, but not that type of evangelical.
Yes.
And we're LGBT welcoming, unlike other people. And so what I had struggled with, because I founded Episcopal Church in 2014, the denomination broadly. And so for 12 years as Episcopalian, I can tell you I hear 90% of the time what we are not.
Yeah.
Instead of what we actually believe. And I think that to some extent it's kind of I'm tired of defining what we aren't versus what we should be.
Yeah. I think that's a really significant point, and most people do not want to join a tradition that is set in opposition against others unless you're setting yourselves up for being an oppositional tradition. I think that that's really important for us to claim what our identity is. I think that we can frame the fact that we are and inclusive. This is a thing that we can state positively without stating it over and against some other tradition that isn't. I think that we can claim our sort of rich liturgical identity, both the sort of the history of our Reformed and Protestant theology, along with our more Catholic and traditional worship, framing that as a positive rather than instead of being like blank, blank, and blank. And then I think also reaching in to say that Benedictine tradition and saying that we are a tradition that is rooted in those virtues like prayer and hospitality and contemplation, and also being willing to say to people, we are not necessarily for everyone. One of the beauties of American denominationalism is that there are other traditions that will scratch a different itch if, say, you want lots of liturgical innovation. The ELCA and the UCC do that pretty well, right? We are not going to ever probably be the most liturgically innovative group on the street. and that's not going to work for everyone. So rather than sort of trying to be all things to all people, be clear about who we are, be clear about being rooted in that sort of historic and identity. And then also, I think, this is a practical point, I do think it's important for you to put what you believe somewhere very prominently. So, a good starting place is the Nicene Creed. That's sort of the foundation of our what we believe statement. But then also make sure to work in whatever positions you have on inclusion, because that is also something that can set you apart without setting you over and against another tradition. So that if you want to actually look at I'm trying to remember how we formed it. We have a What We Believe page on TrinityOsh, TRINTYOSH.org. So you can look at our website and see the belief page to see a little bit about what we have done in terms of that outward facing, and then we print that on the back of every bulletin, our belief statement. So one of the things as we get back into this hygiene metaphor is that it is not something that is only metaphorical, right? So think about someone you maybe have known who has gone into a place of real despair or a place of withdrawal. One of the really unfortunate things that can often happen is that it becomes like drinking seawater, where the more that they withdraw into themselves, the less that they take care of themselves physically, in terms of their physical hygiene, in terms of grooming, in terms of bathing, in terms of making sure that they have the presentable clothes, these sorts of things. And this becomes this really terrible spiral, because this spiral leads to fewer and fewer and fewer people wanting to engage with them because they become more and more physically uncomfortable to be around. Well, churches do this too. Maybe this is something that you've noticed in your communities, but as churches shrink and the community of people you know becomes more and more insular, becomes more and more parochial, as the community becomes more and more long-term people that you have known, you start to stop noticing things that new people would notice. You start to, like a family, put up with more and more and more body odor, dirty clothes, sink full of dishes. The sorts of things that when you know and love someone, you are more likely to give them a pass on. But the more that happens in our church community, the more that we don't notice the issues that are going on. And then as we stop noticing what newcomers see, newcomers, when they do arrive, are more likely to be put off by the community. But because we've gotten used to it, we're less likely to hear their critiques as legitimate critiques of what's going on, and more likely to hear it as an attack on our identity. We're less likely to experience that as something that we need to be taking in and actually acting upon, and we're more likely to say, oh, well, that's a them problem. They can take us or leave us the way we are. And so we have to break this loop, because what we find out is that newcomers aren't just an output of a healthy congregation, they're also part of the input cycle. Newcomers help to remind us of the things that we don't see the longer we've been in the system. So, this is where we come back to what if we actually have a hygiene problem rather than an identity problem? I don't think that our worship and our programming is driving people away. I don't think that's what it is. In a second, we'll talk about the ways in which worship might become a barrier to people engaging with the community, but I don't actually think that by the time someone has actually been seated for the beginning of the service and begun to engage, even if it's confusing, even if it's different, even if it is something that they are not used to, that is the primary thing that keeps them from coming back, if they've showed up in the first place. I really think that it's likely, or at least possible, that a significant portion of why we do not see growth has to do with these questions of institutional hygiene, which again are questions about hospitality to the stranger. So, there's a lot of different stories that you can find out there, horror stories, that kind of match what I talked about at the beginning. Has anyone ever experienced a congregation where you've gone and no one talked to you? Yeah. Has anyone ever experienced that in the Episcopal Church? Yes. Has anyone ever experienced a community where the people who do talk to you as though you're a mark? Someone to be converted in to help with their sort of institutional issues rather than someone who they want to get to know?
Vampire your blood.
Yeah, that's right. It's a vampiric kind of approach to things. That is unfortunately then what often passes as hospitality or connection in churches, is that if you get someone to talk to you, even unwittingly, people will say things like, oh, what a lovely voice, you should sing in the choir, right? That's not, yes?
It didn't happen to me, but I witnessed it in a previous congregation where we had a young family come in with 4 kids, and like people just like went nuts, like swarming
Oh, yeah.
You know, and they never came back.
It's probably not a good thing to treat someone like a curiosity or a zoo animal on any of the sort of, you know, if it's a protected class for hiring, you probably shouldn't bring that up with them as a reason why you're excited that they're there. But it happens. We're so glad to have you. We need young people. We're so glad to have you. Would you consider serving on the buildings and grounds? You know, whatever it might be. That's not to say that you don't want to get people engaged and involved down the road, but that's not the place for it. Especially, and this is a place that's a little beyond what we do now, because there is some skill that goes into developing how you can really adeptly engage with people. Some of it is reading the room about, is this person seem really introverted and wants maybe just a handshake and a nice to see you, versus is this someone who looks like they're really hoping to get hooked up to several conversations. But what I can say is almost anyone can immediately pick up the sort of cues of, don't say things like, I've never seen you before. Say things like, oh, I don't think we've met, it's great to have you. Those are the sorts of reframings that we can have. Make sure that people have a little bit of that sense that, and this is something where teaching on it is important. If there are new people who come, if people have come in, don't swarm them, but do make sure someone has talked to them. And that's just a matter of having a little bit of situational awareness. That's just a matter of teaching people to just read the room and look around and say, does it look like this person has been engaged with, or does it look like they are isolated and have not had anyone touch base with them? So again, these horror stories exist all over the place, and you can very easily find them on the internet. And what's interesting is that when you look at these stories, you often find that it either leads to A, the person never landing in a church, or landing in a different church. That if this is someone who is church shopping and they go somewhere and they are completely ignored, they feel completely invisible, they are going to continue to be invisible as they walk out the door, and they're going to either go nowhere or go somewhere else until they find someone who says hello to them when they show up and treats them as a human being in search of relationship rather than a number or a cog to help fix the system. And that's really what we want to do when we take this approach of hospitality, is this approach of institutional hygiene. Institutional hygiene begins with asking, how welcoming and authentically welcoming are we of people who have never shown up before? Everything else flows from that basic principle. Everything else is about how do we welcome people and remove the unnecessary impediments, the unnecessary stumbling blocks, so that we can make room for, and this is true, the necessary stumbling blocks and impediments that exist in Christianity. It's really hard to get someone to a place where they're comfortable enough to be uncomfortable with, say, a call for repentance, or a call for sacrifice, or a call for leaving everything behind and dying daily, if they're so uncomfortable from the fact that they couldn't find a bathroom, or no one talked to them. Right? Those are unnecessary impediments to the gospel. We already have enough necessary ones. So, what I want you to think about now is, in the past year, how many first-time visitors came to your church who you can think of by name who never came back? How many came that you never got their name who never came back? And how confident are you that each of those people received any kind of follow-up when they came? Just take a couple minutes and think about that. And this isn't going to be something that we're going to report out on, but it will be something that that leads into your reflections on other things that we'll be doing today. But just take a couple minutes and think about that.
Yeah, you did.
As you keep that on your mind, I want to pull back to that original story that I told. If I walked out of that church saying, I will never go back to that church unless the bishop tells me I have to for some sort of programming, how likely do you think it is that any other newcomer is going to do that? Now, I also will say, most of our systems, unfortunately, have antibodies built in to make sure that we can say, oh, well, that's not how it works here. Because often, when new members do come into these kind of communities, they come in via prior relationships. And so they're built in people that they know who are going to interact with them when they get there. But what I can also tell you is that, so our church has been blessed with growth since I have been rector. Almost 90% of that growth has literally been people Googling our church and then coming to our church. They found out about the Episcopal Church and they said, I want to come to the Episcopal Church in town, and that's where they come from. Now, it would be amazing if 50% of that growth came from people inviting and bringing people in. That would just be extra icing on the cake. But by and large, the growth that we've gotten has been strangers off the street. And that's really important to recognize that in sort of a really well-functioning system, that's probably going to be a lot of your growth. If it's not people Googling your church, it's people knowing about programs that you're doing out in the community. It's people looking for a particular form of Christianity. It's people, and this is, we talk about Red Door evangelism not being the primary way we should do it, and that's true. Red Door evangelism is the idea that people will see the distinctiveness of our red doors and come in off the street because of that. But it is true that one of the number one reasons people state for why they finally stopped by is they walked by and saw things happening. People do just walk in off the street. And that's part of why institutional hygiene is so important, is because those are the people who you have to welcome as Christ. And those are the people who, if you don't welcome as Christ, you likely will have them go be welcomed somewhere else or nowhere.
Can I just add, and people
Yep.
who move into the community?
That's right, people who move into the community. We can talk offline also. There's some really excellent resources for very easily getting in front of new movers, your church's identity. We can talk about that too. But I want to point to then another experience. There was a Sojourners article by a woman who was an ex-evangelical who became an agnostic and approached the church that she kind of at least began dipping her toe back in with. And one of the points that she made was that the pastor held her baby while she got coffee, that people engaged with her as a human being. They were not pushy about doctrine or joining type things. And I will say, the takeaway of the article was, so maybe churches can kind of relax all that doctrine stuff. That is not my takeaway. But I do think it is worth pointing out that the time to really push that is probably not someone's first visit. That is a conversation that develops through relationship with someone. And actually, if we take it back to the woman at the well, this reading from last week for the gospel, we can see that it's okay if someone's relationship and understanding of Jesus develops through time. That reading shows that the woman moved from calling him sir to a prophet to finally Savior of the world.
In an hour.
Well, in an hour, yeah.
What do you mean through time?
Well, through time, okay, but so we'll step back and say, remembering that the Gospel of John is a theological commentary on a synoptic tradition, which is not necessarily meant to be representative of actual chronological time.
So as long as you take that scripture not as it's said, then it makes sense.
Well, as long as you understand the genre of what the Gospel of John is, yeah.
Okay.
That through time, people can develop an understanding and relationship with Jesus. This is also not to say that we should, again, I would pull back. I don't think pulling back on doctrinal commitments is actually what we should be doing. But I do think that if what your first thing you do with someone is say, in order to join this community, you have to believe this, and this, that is probably going to be, even for someone who does believe those things, somewhat off-putting. So, the next point is about follow-up. Because we can talk all we want about, hospitality and welcome to the people when they come in. And that is something that you absolutely need to do from a theological standpoint. This is a matter of welcoming people. This is a matter of making sure that they feel seen and recognized as Christ in your midst. But what's interesting is from a research standpoint, there's not a lot of data to actually corroborate those stories that the no one talked to me led to me not coming back. It seems intuitively the case that if people feel invisible, that they're probably not going to come back. Like I said, that was my experience, but there's not actually a lot of research data that says that that's the primary locus of losing people. There is a ton of research data that says no follow-up is where you lose people. A ton. So, the United Methodist Church, the Lewis Center for Church Leadership, looked at the Church of the Resurrection, which is one of the largest United Methodist churches in the country. And they found that strong follow-up led to 20 to 25%, not just return, but ultimate membership in the church. That there was 20 to 25% of the people who visited ultimately became members as the result of prompt, personal, and pleasant follow-up with those people. There's been a lot of research on the importance of, again, prompt, personal, and pleasant follow-up with people, and multi-point follow-up as well. Not just one email, not just one text message, not just one card, but multiple points of follow-up with a person who has come to your congregation in order to make them feel integrated into that community. There is, Eric Hadaway, I think, actually pointed out that there is something like the possibility of an 8 times greater chance of growth in congregations that have a tight follow-up system compared to churches that have no follow-up system. The research, so I'm doing some research for Forward Movement right now on the 150 Episcopal churches that have grown consistently from 2011 until 2023 through COVID, such that their ASA is higher in 2023 than it was in 2019 or 2011. And one of the most consistent early findings I am seeing, this is not, I haven't run the data fully yet, but one of the things that seems to be emerging is the churches that are growing fastest in that cohort have a really tight follow-up system, which again, that means something like prompt, multi-point, and also systematized. And the churches almost always in that group have some kind of follow-up system. So if you are not following up with people who have visited, that is probably one of the biggest places where you can implement some institutional hygiene in your community. I'm going to run through actually what that follow-up can look like. So this is a point about part of your follow-up system should probably include a handwritten note from someone, whether that's the rector, whether that's the senior warden, whether that's your outreach person, but a handwritten note thanking the person for visiting and inviting them to come back makes a huge difference. I actually just got an email from a member of my church thanking me for the birthday card that I sent. I send a birthday card to everyone in the church every year, but what's wild is this last year, I got extremely off schedule. So some people received their birthday cards really closer to their half birthdays than really. And even that stood out to people. The number of times I've heard from people that having received a handwritten note after they visited was like the deciding factor is incredible. Now again, this is anecdata, but I think that fits into that larger schema that we're seeing, that follow-up leads to conversion from visitor to member. And follow up in a personal way that someone can see was not just formulaic, even if it's part of a system, makes a difference. So the question I have for you to think about right now as I go into talking a little bit about the nuts and bolts is, Right now, if someone filled out a new member card at your church last week, would you know that there was follow-up? What actually would have happened to that card and to their name and to the follow-up after that? So think about that for just a second, because that's really that's the meat of what we want to talk about walking away with from this session. Yes, figure out a way to be welcoming and hospitable once someone gets there, but what do you do once they leave that first time? So my recommendation is, first of all, you have to get their information. If you're going to follow up with someone, you have to get their information. Most Episcopal churches do one of two things, if they do anything. They have a pew card, or they have a guest book at the back of the church. Both of those introduce barriers that make it less likely that you are going to get someone's follow-up information. The guest book is the most barrier. Right? You have to actively go to it. By filling it out, you are marking yourself as a newcomer in that community, and you are signaling to everyone, I am not from here. I will also say one of the things we actually do at Trinity is everyone fills out a reusable name tag every week. We don't have, we disappeared all of our permanent name tags because we wanted to reduce one of those insider-outsider distinctions that we had. So everyone fills out one of these. It's in their bulletin along with their connection cards. So that's the next thing I'll say is that card in the pew, that's a better step. It at least is in front of the person. But the question is, do they have a pen? Are they going to know it's there? So you need to make an announcement about it. And then, are they going to actually be willing to pull it out and fill it out in front of people who are not doing that? Are they going to mark themselves as an outsider? Again, we might say, we don't care. We love visitors. We love new people coming here. But they might not be thinking that. Human beings do not like to set themselves up as outsiders. And so if we can reduce those psychological barriers that keep people from doing that, we will probably get more follow-up information. So the system we have developed at Trinity is actually based on again, evangelical work by Nelson Searcy. It's called a connection card. And so every Sunday in the bulletin, there is a card that everyone fills out. At the announcements, there's a very short script inviting people to fill their card out. And whether you are there for the first time or for the 5,000th time, you take your card out. There's a pen that is attached to your bulletin that allows you to fill out both your name tag and the connection card. And during the announcements, while we're waiting before the offertory, people fill out their connection cards and then drop them in the alms basins. Now, we are actually going to be moving in a more Episcopal direction. That is sometimes seen as a little bit of a hard sell for people, and we're actually going to go to having two cards, a new member card, or a visitor card, and then a member card. The visitor card is going to be a little bit sparser. It's going to be basically offering people different avenues for how they want follow-up. It's going to be very clear that this is not about gathering information for solicitation, but instead is about being able to reach back out and engage in care with them. That this is about really just being able to check in and see how they were doing. And also, one of the things that you need to do if you want to get Gen Z contact information is have a disclaimer somewhere that says, this will not be used for anything else. People are increasingly worried about what their data is used for, and so people who want to engage with the church but are concerned about what their data is used for might not fill it out if you don't very clearly state this will be used for follow-up and hospitality and only for that. So what you can do is very easily build that out, build out that system. You can have a static card. If you don't have someone who is ready and able to put together a dynamic card with changing different events that people can sign up for every week, you can have a static card that goes in the bulletin that everyone fills out, that is the place both where newcomers can leave their information and people who have been there for forever can update their information or leave prayer requests. Or anyone can leave prayer requests. But that our connection card is also where people leave their prayer requests as well. So this provides this reason for people to fill it out that goes beyond because they're a newcomer.
Do you have examples of those?
I can send examples of them, yes. So if you connect with me after, we can send them. But it really does not have to be complicated. It can be church logo or name, email, phone number, I would like prayer. It could be that easy. So after someone has filled it out, you want to make sure that, again, you have that multi-point contact and follow up with it. So hopefully someone leaves both, either an email address or a phone number and an address, a physical address. So you want to frame it in such a way that you encourage people to leave at least those 2 points of contact along with their name. That day or the next day, they should receive a text or an email thanking them for having come and inviting them to join again. Sometime that week, a handwritten note should show up in their mailbox if you get their address. And that handwritten note would be even better if it's got a gift card to a local coffee shop, something, as a reminder of your thanks for that person showing up. Don't frame it, and you gotta be very careful that you're not framing this as bribing them to come back. It is a matter of saying, basically, we want to help you integrate into the larger community that we engage in too. So, and that's the way that I frame it when I write my cards is something like, I hope you felt your spirits uplifted at church this week, so here, have another kind of pick-me-up on us. Grab a cup of coffee at Elsewhere, my favorite coffee shop in town. So that's what we do. And then make sure that when the person comes, someone is responsible for remembering their name and inviting them to coffee. Just coffee, lunch, something, a next deeper connection point sometime after their second visit. Here's the really big thing. When you're doing this, you need to make sure that someone owns this process every week. You can have multiple people involved with it, you can have multiple people sending cards, collecting the cards, whatever it is, but someone needs to be the person where the buck stops, who says, yes, I can confirm that all of the necessary follow-ups happened this week, or no, we dropped the ball on this person here, let's see how we can remedy that. That follow-up tracking can happen in a number of ways. If you have Realm, for instance, or another church management software, often they will have like a system for doing like a pathway, allowing you to move someone through steps where someone has to sign off on, yes, this step happened. That's probably the smoothest way to do it, but also the largest learning curve. You can do a Google spreadsheet that just has a column for every single thing, every step that needs to happen, and someone signs it when it's happened along with the date. You can have a physical ledger where this happens if that's what works for you, but you need to track when these things have happened, not as a way of turning this into a mechanical process, but as a way of making sure that you really follow through on the offer of hospitality that began when someone visited the church. So, I want to say then, our liturgy is beautiful. Often our programming is great. Our theology offers room for people to explore while still being rooted in the Christian tradition. In most cases, what we have is not a theology or a programming or a liturgy problem. What we have is a hospitality and follow-up problem, which again is a hygiene problem. And hygiene problems are fixable. In fact, you're going to probably walk away, you are going to walk away with at least 2 first steps about how you might be able to go forth and begin analyzing and fixing some of the hygiene problems in your communities. And so before we go to our break, I'm going to leave you with 3 questions to help frame the breakout session. So this is not like you have to answer these in the breakout questions. This is to prime the pump for the activities that you're going to be doing there. But the first one is, when on a Sunday morning is a newcomer most likely to feel confused, ignored, or pressured in your community? And don't think buildings yet. That's something we're going to talk about next. When, in terms of the programming, whether that's when they encounter ushers, when they encounter greeters, when they are sitting down and taking part in the service, when coffee hour happens, when they're moving between spaces, when are they most likely to feel confused, ignored, or pressured? Then second, really put on your seeing from another person's point of view hat. Try to remove yourself as much as possible from the familiarity of your space and your community and say, what would you say, what would a newcomer say about interaction with members at your church? Really try to imagine it, thinking through, from the standpoint of those people who came and never came back, what was that probably like for them? walking through the space, being encountered or not encountered? Did they even have any interactions with members? And then finally, what is one thing, and we probably all have at least one, related to follow-up or welcome that you know needs attention, but no one wants to say out loud in your community? So that's what I leave with you with to think about. Yeah, take your picture, go ahead and write these down. I'll do the see you after lunch slide. See you after lunch, and then you can go back to seeing these questions to help you moving on.